Michael Harris thought his quiet Arizona suburb was peaceful until HOA President Karen Walker demanded he hand over his private terrace for her social club's party. Karen's arrogance and controlling nature made it clear she expected everyone to bow to her whims. But then, an unexpected visitor at his doorstep, Governor James Randolph, changed everything, giving Michael a chance he never imagined. And just wait until you see how this showdown unfolded and why justice in the end prevailed. My life in a quiet Arizona suburb had always felt predictable and safe. I loved the routine, morning coffee on the porch, neighbors greeting each other with polite nods, and the gentle hum of suburban life drifting through the streets. I had invested not just money, but heart into my home, pruning the garden every weekend, repainting the fences, and making sure every corner of my property reflected care and pride. It was my sanctuary, or so I thought. That morning started like any other. Sunlight poured through the blinds, warming the kitchen, where I had left my coffee steaming on the counter. I reached for the stack of mail, shuffling through bills and advertisements, expecting the usual mundane correspondence. But then I saw it. A crisp envelope embossed with the HOA logo staring back at me like a challenge. My fingers tightened around it as a flicker of unease passed through me. There was something about the tone of those letters over the years, always formal, always precise, that had a way of carrying authority, but this one felt different. I tore it open, and the words jumped at me, making my stomach drop. Karen Walker demands that you provide your property for the club's guests. Immediately. Just reading it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. My first reaction was disbelief. Karen Walker, the HOA president whose reputation for rigid rules and self-importance was legendary, was demanding my property for some social event I had no invitation to attend. My property, my space, my sanctuary. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I sank into the kitchen chair, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced through the possibilities. Had there been some misunderstanding? Could this really be a legal demand? I couldn't imagine a scenario where anyone could just claim a private yard as a playground for their personal convenience. And yet, here it was, in black and white. Her signature at the bottom carrying that familiar weight of authority. The anger didn't just simmer, it surged like a wave crashing against me. I could almost hear Karen's voice echoing in my head, dripping with self-importance. Like the world revolved around her schedule, her events, her rules. How could she possibly believe that her social whims outweighed my rights as a homeowner? That my private yard, painstakingly maintained over years, could be commandeered on a whim. The thought was infuriating. I felt a flush of heat climb my neck and into my face, my chest tightening with every heartbeat. I gripped the edges of the letter so hard that the paper crumpled under my fingers. Each word seemed to mock me. Immediately. Demands. For the club's guests. It wasn't just a letter. It was a declaration that someone who had never set foot in my garden, believed they had the right to dictate how I lived in my own home. That thought alone was enough to make my fists clench. I paced the kitchen, my anger shifting from confusion to resolve. This wasn't a simple inconvenience. This was a challenge, one I couldn't ignore. My home wasn't a playground, my yard wasn't a commodity, and my patience wasn't infinite. I had to think carefully, but I knew one thing clearly. I wasn't going to let someone bully me into surrendering my space. By the time I set the letter down, the initial shock had transformed into a burning determination. Anger had ignited a fire inside me. A clarity that, while Karen thought she was in control, I wasn't about to let that happen. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by sunlight and the normalcy of suburban life, I realized that the fight was just beginning. A few days later, the tension I had felt in my kitchen became a tangible, living presence in my own backyard. I stepped outside one morning, hoping for a quiet moment with my coffee, only to see them, Karen Walker and her entourage, setting up tables, umbrellas, and decorations on my terrace as if they owned the place. My heart sank, a dull ache spreading across my chest. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. This was my space, my sanctuary, and here they were, laughing, arranging chairs, joking with each other, and entirely ignoring the fact that they were trespassing on someone else's property. The sound of their laughter, so light and careless, cut through me like a sharp edge. Each chuckle felt like a reminder that all my years of careful work, all the care I'd poured into my home, were being disregarded. I felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle over me. Not just anger anymore, but a deep, gnawing pain. It wasn't just about a party. It was about the violation of trust, the sense that my rights didn't matter, that my efforts to be a conscientious neighbor were invisible to people like Karen. I watched them from the patio, hidden behind the hedge, feeling the helplessness seep into my bones. I knew I had options. I could call the HOA. I could file a complaint. I could even involve the local authorities. But the bureaucracy of the system itself felt suffocating. HOA regulations, usually designed to maintain order, now seemed like an impenetrable wall that protected the very person who was infringing on my life. Their rules were meant to govern fairly, but in this moment they felt like a weapon pointed directly at me, a shield behind which Karen wielded her authority without accountability. Frustration mingled with my pain, a bitter cocktail of emotions that left me tense and restless. I thought back to all the ways I had contributed to our neighborhood, volunteering at block cleanups, attending meetings, following every rule, paying every fee on time. I had done everything that was expected of a responsible homeowner, yet here I was, standing powerless while someone else dictated the use of my property. It was not just unfair. It was crushing. I clenched my fists and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wanted to confront them, to shout, to demand respect for what was mine, but I knew that any rash action could escalate things further. Instead, I allowed myself to fully feel the sting of the moment. My pain wasn't just about the terrace or the party. It was about feeling invisible, about realizing that years of conscientious living could be dismissed by sheer arrogance. As I stood there, hidden in the shadows, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. The hurt was real, and it throbbed with every glance I stole at them. But beneath that pain, a quiet determination began to form. This wasn't the end of the story. This injustice, as sharp as it was a spark, one that would eventually ignite the fight I was about to take on. I just didn't know yet how or when I would turn the tide. Even as they laughed and organized their party, oblivious to the emotional weight they were imposing, I promised myself that this moment of helplessness would not define me. The pain was real, yes, but it was also the first step toward reclaiming control of my home, my space, and my peace of mind. Just when the situation felt entirely hopeless, as if the weight of bureaucracy and arrogance had pinned me in place, an unexpected event shifted the tide. I was standing on my terrace, still hidden behind the hedge, watching Karen and her friends set up for what felt like an inevitable takeover of my property. My chest ached with frustration, and a heavy sense of futility had begun to settle in. I was almost convinced that this battle was already lost. But then, the sound of footsteps on the sidewalk pulled me from my thoughts. I turned, squinting through the morning sun, and my eyes fell on a figure I didn't expect to see. Arizona Governor James Randolph, walking with purpose toward a neighbor's house for an official engagement. There was an unmistakable air of authority and calm confidence about him, the kind of presence that commanded attention without needing to raise a voice. And then, almost instinctively, my gaze flicked to Karen. The effect was instantaneous. Karen, who had carried herself with such certainty and dominance just moments before, froze in place. Her shoulders stiffened, her smile faltered, and a shade of pale spread across her face. In that instant, it was as though her carefully constructed armor of authority had vanished. The bravado that had allowed her to issue demands on my property dissolved under the simple reality that someone far more influential had arrived, someone whose opinion carried real weight. I realized, almost with a jolt, that this was my moment. Opportunity had arrived in the most unexpected form. I took a slow, deliberate breath to steady myself, feeling the tension in my body ebb slightly, replaced with cautious optimism. I stepped forward, approaching Governor Randolph with calm confidence. There was no need for theatrics or anger. The situation spoke for itself. I explained succinctly and clearly. The HOA had overstepped its bounds. Karen had attempted to commandeer my private property for her own social event, and despite my efforts to resolve the matter through proper channels, I had felt powerless against her authority. The governor listened intently, his expression thoughtful but approachable, nodding as I outlined the events. There was an unmistakable sense of fairness in his demeanor, a feeling that he was genuinely considering the injustice I had endured, and in that moment, I felt a spark of hope ignite. The impossible, the overwhelming weight of the past few days suddenly seemed negotiable. Karen, meanwhile, remained frozen, unable to hide the shock that someone of such stature was aware of her actions. I could see her internal struggle, the panic, the realization that her usual tactics would not work here, that her dominance was irrelevant in the presence of someone whose authority mattered far more. Her usual confidence, so carefully cultivated, had no power against this unforeseen development. With the governor's quiet but firm support, the dynamics of the confrontation shifted completely. I felt a renewed sense of possibility, a deep surge of hope coursing through me. This was no longer a fight I was facing alone. I had an ally whose influence could restore fairness and respect for the rights that Karen had so arrogantly tried to override. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to believe that my home, my sanctuary, could remain mine, intact, respected, and free from unjust interference. That day, the sense of helplessness that had weighed so heavily on me began to lift. Hope, quiet but unshakable, had arrived at my doorstep, carried on the presence of someone who understood the importance of fairness and the power of standing up for what is right. With Governor Randolph now aware of the situation and quietly lending his support, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Karen Walker, once brimming with overconfidence and a sense of untouchable authority, seemed to shrink in stature before my eyes. Her usual air of dominance faltered, replaced by hesitation and uncertainty. It was almost surreal to watch the woman who had issued demands with such conviction now falter under the weight of fairness and reason. She glanced repeatedly at the governor, then at me, her voice wavering as she attempted to regain control, but the words no longer carried the force they once had. The change was subtle but undeniable. The party, which had seemed imminent and unstoppable just days ago, was quietly called off. The tables and decorations that had begun to invade my terrace were dismantled, and the HOA's demands regarding my property were formally withdrawn. I stood on my own porch, taking in the sight of my untouched garden, the familiar hum of my neighborhood once again restored to a calm rhythm. The relief that washed over me was profound, almost overwhelming. For days, I had carried the weight of helplessness and frustration, and now it was lifted in a single decisive moment. As I watched the last of Karen's entourage leave, I realized that what had occurred went far beyond a simple victory over one person's arrogance. It was a reminder of the importance of resilience, of standing firm in one's convictions even when the odds seem insurmountable. The right to your home, to your personal space, is not something to be surrendered lightly. Yet the triumph was not just mine alone. It belonged equally to the quiet but unwavering presence of someone who recognized injustice and took action, reminding me that fairness can prevail when justice-minded people choose to intervene. I took a slow, deliberate walk across my terrace, running my hands over the railings I had polished countless times, feeling the familiar textures beneath my fingertips. Every corner of this space, every flower bed, and every carefully maintained plant felt like a testament to perseverance. The emotional weight of the past days lingered, but now it was transformed into something profoundly positive. Pain and frustration had given way to a sense of empowerment. In that moment, inspiration surged through me. I realized that sometimes what feels like an overwhelming obstacle, someone asserting control unfairly, a system that seems impenetrable, a moment of seeming helplessness, can become the catalyst for growth. Injustice, as painful as it can be, has a way of testing our resilience, sharpening our resolve, and ultimately pushing us toward inner strength we might never have discovered otherwise. I looked across the neighborhood, seeing the ordinary life continuing. Neighbors walking their dogs, children riding bikes along the street, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. And yet, for me, everything felt different. I had faced an imposing challenge, stood firm despite fear and uncertainty, and emerged not just victorious but transformed. The lesson was clear: standing up for what is right, with patience, clarity, and the support of fair-minded allies, can overcome even the boldest and most controlling forces. That day, my terrace was more than just a piece of property. It became a symbol of perseverance, courage, and hope. It was a reminder that no matter how unjust a situation may seem, steadfastness and belief in one's rights can turn even the darkest moments into stories of triumph, stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the power each of us holds when we refuse to yield.